Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess. I thought I'd tackle a tough one today, but I won an award for writing an article about this, and I thought I would turn maybe my article into a video. And the name of the article was, What is a Backward Pawn? So I'm going to talk about the same thing today. I think I won a Chess Journalist of America award for honorable mention for best instruction for my article, What's a Backward Pawn? And what I did in that article was I took several books and I took their definition of backward pawn and I showed how they were different and showed my definition and talked about the differences and why I thought my definition was better. So let's do the same thing here. This is a difficult task because there's no official dictionary of chess. We can't go to an official dictionary and say, this is the definition of a backward pawn, and anybody else who has a different definition is wrong. So in a sense, anybody who comes up with a similar definition, even though it's a little bit different, can't be thought of as being wrong because they're entitled to their opinion. So if I give you this video, what I think is a backward pawn, and some other master watches this video and tells you, I don't agree with Dan, that doesn't make them right and me wrong or vice versa. It's because there is no official definition. So let's get right to it. The easiest way to start with telling people what a backward pawn is to start by telling them what a backward pawn is not. A lot of people get confused, just like when people get confused with the bishop pair. They think the bishop pair means you have two bishops, and that's because in English that's exactly what the word bishop pair means. But of course bishop pair is short for the advantage of the bishop pair, which means something slightly different. Same thing with backward pawn. Backward pawn is very close to back pawn. So a lot of people think a backward pawn is a back pawn. In other words, let's say these are the only three pawns on the board. The pawns on c2 and d3 and e4. We know there's other pieces. There's got to be at least a white king and a black king. But for now, let's just say these are the only three pieces on the board. The back pawn of this pawn chain is c2. So a lot of people think c2 is a backward pawn. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The c2 pawn in this position, we could put a white king and a black king on the board if we wanted to. The c2 pawn in this position is an extremely powerful connected pass pawn. It's not backward at all. So to call this pawn, the back pawn of a pawn chain, a backward pawn, is a complete misnomer. It just, it would be like anything else in life where you have two words that sound similar, but you would say that they're exactly the same. Like if you said an elephant and an elevator were basically the same thing. So a backward pawn and a back pawn in a pawn chain, are not at all the same thing. All right, let's add some black pawns to the board. Let's put a black pawn on c3 and d4 and e5. Now, according to my definition, the pawn on c2 is still not a backward pawn. And I think almost every author would say that the pawn on c2 is not a backward pawn. Why is it not a backward pawn, even though it's still the back pawn on the pawn chain? It's because a pawn that has another pawn in front of it, by definition, cannot be a backward pawn. So here, all six pawns have a pawn right in front of them. We call that a ram, when two pawns are up against each other. If a pawn is part of a ram, it can't be backward. All right, so let's keep going and let's change it a little bit. Let's take off the pawn at c3. Now, the pawn at c2 can move, but if he moves, he's got problems due to the other pawns. And here, yes, we could call this, in fact, we should call this a backward pawn, because if it moves up one, the pawn on d4 can take it, and if it moves up two, the pawn on d4 can take it en passant. So this would be a backward pawn. So now we're in search of a definition. Let me start by reading you a definition from a book that I don't like, and then we'll talk about why I don't like it, and we'll talk about making it a little bit better. So I'm picking up a book called Chess Strategy for Club Players by Herman Gruten, and I think this book may have won an award also. And in this book, I'll read you his definition, which is a little bit convoluted, but that's what happens when you try to define backward pawn a little bit. He said, a backward pawn is a pawn standing on a half-open file which cannot be protected by its pawn colleagues and which also has no pawn colleagues next to it. This makes the square in front of the pawn weak and the opponent can take firm control of it. Therefore, a backward pawn is a major source of concern, but there are also other kinds of pawns that we call weak. Okay, I don't like that definition for a couple reasons. So let's talk about some of the reasons. One of the reasons is he says there's no pawn colleagues next to it, so therefore it's backward. All right, let's take a counterexample here, and let's explain to you why I don't like that. He says, so let's take this pawn here. Now this pawn is a backward pawn. If it goes up to e4, the black pawn can capture it, so that makes it backward. Okay, well, how can we change the position a little? Well, we could make it even more backward. Backward has degrees of backwardness. If we put a pawn on f5, a black pawn on f5, now the pawn on e3 is even more backward. Well, it still can't go up one square. What's the difference? Well, the difference is if there's no black pawn on f5, we know there's got to be at least kings on the board. It's impossible to have a chess position without kings. So, for instance, if I had a white king near that e4 square, and black had a king somewhere, even though I have a backward pawn, I could still push it up the board and try to create a passed pawn by playing e4. Now, whether white would be winning if he does that, well, you ought to know the answer to that if you watched my two-part video, King and Pawn Against King. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. But in any case, the pawn on e4, even though it's backward, can be made non-backward by pushing it up. But if I put a black pawn on f5, and white can't do anything about the black pawns here, now no amount of piece support will help it. If I put a king on d3, I still can't go to e4 without losing a pawn. If I even help it with a bishop, I still can't go to e4 without losing a pawn. And no matter how many pieces I put on it, I can't help it go up to e4. Anytime he's got two pawns on a square and I have 0 pawns supporting that square, I can't go up. But suppose I put a white pawn on f3. Well, clearly, if I don't have a black pawn on f5, then playing e4 is safe. And that would mean that my pawn on e3, which has a little bit of elements of backwardness, is not backward here because it can safely move up to e4. But if I put a black pawn back on f5, I've got the same problem again. The problem is that this position with the pawns on f3 and f5 is not a lot different than if I take the two pawns on the f file away. In this case, I need a piece to help the pawn go up to e4 safely. In this case, I can't do it at all with the pawn on f5. But with the pawn on f3, I still can't go up to e4 safely without the help of another piece, like a king or a knight or a bishop or something. This is my problem with his definition. Well, that's not my only problem. This is one of the problems with the definition. He says, which also has no pawn colleagues next to it. Well, here we put a colleague next to it, but because black has 2 pawns guarding the square and white only has 1, I think the pawn on e3 in this position is just as backward as the pawn is in this position where there's no f-pawns at all. In each case, he's 1 piece short of needing a piece to safely help it go up. In other words, he needs the king on d3 to help it go up to be safe here. And with the pawn on f3 and a pawn on f5, it's exactly the same thing. He needs that king on d3 or some other type of piece to help him push the pawn up. So here, the pawn is backward. It's less backward than it would be if he didn't have the f3 pawn. But it's still backward nonetheless. So I think saying that he can't have a colleague next to it, whether he means an adjacent file or he means a pawn exactly on the same rank on the adjacent file, whichever he means, I don't think that should be part of the definition. I think that the pawn on f3 does not necessarily preclude the pawn on e3 from being backward. Okay, I have a second problem with the definition, and that is he says a backward pawn is a pawn standing on a half-open file. Well, in all these examples I've given you, I have put the pawn on a half-open file. So here, according to his definition, let's put the white pawn on f4, making this pawn super backward. This pawn is a backward pawn on a semi-open file, and it's a very weak pawn. But suppose I put a black pawn on the e file also. Suppose I put a black pawn on e6. Does that mean that the white pawn on e3 is no longer backward? Well, according to this definition, which says a backward pawn is a pawn standing on a half-open file which cannot be protected by its pawn colleagues and which also has no pawn colleagues next to it, that would say this pawn is no longer backward just by putting that black pawn on e6. I have a severe problem with that definition. I don't think putting the pawn on a6 has any effect on whether white can push the pawn up or not. I think what it has an effect on is how vulnerable the pawn is. The pawn on e3 is much more vulnerable on a semi-open file than it is on a non-semi-open file. But I don't think the vulnerability of the pawn, but per se, by itself, should cause the definition of the word backward. So I think the pawn on e3 here is backward, and if I take the pawn on e6 away, it's equally backward. It's just more vulnerable because black can now easily attack it with rooks and queens on the e file. I don't think being on a semi-open file is a requirement for making a pawn backward, but some people think it is. Now, I'll tell you a little story. I like to tell little stories. I was writing the 4th edition of my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation, and I think I'll make a video on that book because it's kind of a neat book. And I had to go to a new publisher because the publisher who published my first 3 editions had retired and he wasn't publishing books anymore. And if I wanted to do a 4th edition, I needed a new publisher. And the publisher was a strong player of the 4th edition. And he read my book and he said, "I don't like your definition of backward pawn." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because a backward pawn has to be on a semi-open file." So he had agreed with Gruden. And I said to him, "Okay, well, that's a reasonable definition, but it's not the one that I use. And it's not the one I used in edition 1, 2, or 3 of the book, and I'm the author, and I can point to you other authors who agree with my definition that you don't have to be on a semi-open file to be a backward pawn, and I would like to keep my definition, even if you don't agree with it." And thankfully, the publisher agreed with me, and he let me keep my definition in the book. But he was brought up with closer to the Gruden definition of the fact that a backward pawn has to be on a semi-open file. All right, let's look at another book and look at his definition and see if it's any better. So we're going to take The Complete Idiot's Guide to Chess. I think if an adult comes up to you and says, "I just started playing chess seriously, and I'd like to have a beginner's book that I can start out with that really teaches me the basics, what's a good book?" Well, if he doesn't know the moves at all, really, I would start with this book, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Chess by Patrick Wolf, Grandmaster Wolf. I think it's an excellent book, especially the first 2/3 as an introduction to chess. If you have someone who already knows chess and they know how to move the pieces and they're just looking for a basic book on strategy, then I would definitely suggest Jeff Coakley's book, Winning Chess Strategy for Kids. But if they don't know anything at all, then I would go with Complete Idiot's Guide to Chess. Okay, let me read you his definition of a backward pawn. Patrick Wolf says, chess players do sometimes use the phrase backward pawn for the specific case of when a backward pawn can't be defended by another pawn, the square in front of it is not occupied by an opposing pawn, and it can't advance forward safely. Okay, that's closer to my definition. It's not exactly my definition, but it's very close to it. Notice that Grandmaster Wolf does not include the idea of semi-open file on there. So he gives 2 examples of backward pawns here. So let's put up his examples. We'll clear out the board, and we'll put black pawns on these squares here. E5, D6, B7, A7. You can probably guess which pawns are going to be the backward pawns, but you got to wait till you see both sides' pawns because backward pawns very much depend on where the opposing pawns are. C3, B2, A2, Knight E3, Pawn E4, Queen E2, Rook D1, Rook D2, F2, G2, H2, King G1, and black needs a knight also. Knight C6. Okay, well, if we look at all the pawns, and we look at whether they can advance up safely due to the other pawns, the best way to do this is kind of mentally take all the pieces off the board. And the answer is the pawn that really sticks out as being backward is this pawn on D6, which if it goes up to D5, the white pawn can take it from E4. Notice that this pawn is also backed up. The pawn on e4, white pawn, is backed up by a knight on e3, a rook on d2, and a rook on d1. So white has not only got that d5 square guarded by a pawn, but he's got it backed up by 3 other pieces, which makes that pawn really, 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 really tough to move up, even if black tries to support it later with some of his pieces. Right now, black's only got one piece that would guard the pawn if it goes to d5, and that's the rook on d8. Are any of the other pawns on the board backward? Well, no. The white pawn on c3 is not backward. It can go up to c4. The pawn on f7 can go up to f6. And even if you say, yes, but what if it keeps trying to go up to f5? It's guarded once and it's attacked once. So if black in this position, if it were his move and he played f5, that would be a safe move. So that pawn's not backward. Now, if it was white's turn and white plays the move g4, that starts to make the f-pawn partly backward here because it's only guarded once and it's attacked twice. But it also makes the f-pawn backward because even though the f-pawn can go up once, it can't really go anywhere because once it tries to go up twice, it's going to be attacked by black pawns and it's going to have no white pawns to guard it. So if white plays g4, that goes a long way to making both of the f-pawns backward. But in the position in Grandmaster Wolf's book, the pawn is not on g4, it's on g2, and therefore the only pawn on the board that's backward is the d6 pawn. Notice the pawns on e4 and e5 can't possibly be backward, not because they're back pawns of the pawn chain or front pawns of the pawn chain. It has nothing to do with that. It's because they're part of a ram and they can't move, and pawns that are part of a ram, are not backward pawns. If we look at both Gruten's definition and Wolf's definition, they both say that. Notice, I'll read you again what Wolf says. He said, a backward pawn is a pawn that can't be defended by another pawn. The square in front of it is not occupied by an opposing pawn, and it can't advance forward safely. Okay, so he says it's not, the square in front of it is not occupied by an opposing pawn. That's what I've been saying. The pawns on e4 and e5 can't be backward. So you can see where I disagree with Patrick Wolf because he said it can't be defended by another pawn. But in that example that I already showed you, let's go back to that example, where white has a pawn on f3, e3, d4 against, let's say, f5 and d5. Here, the pawn can be guarded by another pawn, which means it's not extremely backward, but it still can't move up without the help of pieces. And I don't see a big difference in terms of safety between this position where you need a piece to bring it up and this position where you also need a piece to bring it up. So yet that would make the difference in Grandmaster Wolf's definition, because here he says it can't be defended by another pawn. Well, if you go to e4, you are defended by another pawn. It's just that that's not enough to move up safely. That's why I disagree more strongly with Gruten's definition. I disagree very slightly with Patrick Wolf's definition, and this is why this particular counterexample here. I think that this pawn on e3 is mildly backward, and I think it's roughly the same amount of backward as it would be here. But here, everybody would agree it's backward. But yet, if I added one pawn to support it and one pawn to stop it so they have the same number of opposing, I've still got -1 in terms of how many pawns are guarding that e4 square for white. Yet, some people would say that makes all the difference in the world on whether it's backward, and I don't think it should be, because the safety issues are roughly the same. Let's look at Grandmaster Wolf's next example, which looks like it comes from a Sicilian. He's got a pawn on, well, let's clear out the board here. Here he has a pawn on e4. This is a typical Sicilian-y kind of position. You'll see why when I put all the pieces on the board. Open Sicilians are e4, c5 lines where white plays knight f3 and then d4, and black plays c takes d4. Let's put all the pieces on the board, and you'll see we have that same kind of pawn structure. Whoops, that c5 pawn was traded off on d4, so it can't be on the board. Okay, let's get the rest of the pieces on the board. Queen c7, rook c8, rook d8, bishop e7, knight d7. Let's give white some pieces. Queen d2, knight c3, king g1, bishop e2, bishop e3, rook a1, knight on b3. Okay, so this position looks a little bit like the position we looked at a couple minutes ago in Grandmaster Wolf's first example. White's got a pawn on e4. That square d5 is also guarded by a knight, and before he had a rook, two rooks on the d file, on the semi-open d file. Here he has a queen and a rook, so this looks a lot the same. The problem is for white that black has a lot more pieces that can support those squares and attack the other squares around it. And if white tries to put a knight on d5 to block the backward pawn, black can simply take that off, and white can't take with the queen, and white would have to take with the pawn, and that pawn would then shield the pawn on d6, and that pawn on d6, as we have said by definition, would no longer be backward. It's the back pawn of the chain, but it's not backward, and that would be positionally less good for white. But white can't put a lot of pressure on this pawn on d6. Black's guarding it with a bishop. He's guarding it with a queen. He's about to move his knight, so he can guard it with a rook. And so in this position, it's a lot safer. So let's read what Grandmaster Wolf says about this in his book, Complete Idiot's Guide to Chess. He says, The conclusion you might draw from this example: it is always bad to have a backward pawn. Well, backward pawns are probably the weakest of all possible pawns, unless you have pawns that are doubled and isolated. He says, compare diagram 6 to diagram 7. Diagram 7 is a position from the Nahdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. Black's position here is much better than in diagram 6 for several reasons. He says, first, black's d-pawn is well defended by the bishop on e7, and though defending the d-pawn makes the bishop passive, in this case it's not too serious because the bishop is usefully placed to defend the king side. 2, black has some influence over the d5 square. For instance, he's got a bishop attacking that square and a knight attacking that square. This is enough to prevent white from permanently occupying it with a piece. See chapter 13 for more explanation about this factor. Black's pawn on e5 helps control white's knight on b3, which is a passive piece. Black's queen and rooks are actively placed along the c-file, or rook is on the c-file. He says, for this reason, the position in diagram 7 is thought to offer about equal chances for both sides, in spite of black's true backward d6 pawn. He said, what's the bottom line? When one pawn advances forward and leaves the other behind, there are pluses and minuses. Unlike the pawn duo, it is not always a strong formation. Whom it favors and why always depends on the particulars of the position. So let's ask Stockfish to analyze this position. Let's say it's black's move. Let's make it black's move. And we will bring up the evaluation so you can see it. And we'll start the computer. And the computer says with black's move, black can play queen to c6, attacking the e4 pawn. And he also is guarding that d5 square again. And the computer's evaluation is minus 0.07 at 23 ply. If we let it think a little further, now he says black can play h6, minus 0.12, minus 0.22. He thinks black has a microscopic advantage here with black's move. Now let's make it white's move. Let's go like that, and we'll start the computer. Now the computer says that white should play knight to c1, taking that knight that's not very good on b3 and getting ready to reposition him, or maybe bishop f3, and it says white is better by about a third of a pawn. Okay, so what does this tell you? If it was black's move, black was microscopically better, but at least equal. And if it's white's move, white's better by about 4/10 of a pawn. That tells you how important tempos are in chess, because black has a backward pawn whether it's his move or not, and he can't get rid of it right away. But if it's his move, the dynamism of the position is such that black has a slight advantage, and if it's white's move, that extra tempo for white allows white to get a slight advantage. So in any case, black has this weak backward d6 pawn, but if it's his move, it's so much less of a disadvantage that he actually is, at least equal here. Let's do one more thing before we stop. Let's show you how this kind of position can occur. E4, C5. He said not off Sicilian. Let's play a not off Sicilian. Let's get the computer's evaluation off the screen so we can give you a bigger screen. There we go. All right, D6, D4. C takes D4, knight takes D4. Knight F6, knight C3. A6. There's the not off Sicilian. If white plays bishop E2, which is what this was likely from, the main line for black, the best move for black, according to the grandmasters and the computers, is to play E5 and voluntarily get a backward d-pawn. White plays knight B3. Black plays bishop E7. White can castle. Black castles. You can see we're slowly heading for that pawn structure we got in the game. White could play A4 to stop black from advancing B5. Black can play bishop to E6. White can continue developing. We're slowly working our way toward that position. Bishop there. Let's take a look at the position. White played A5. Black played knight BD7. White played queen D2. Rook FD8. Rook FD1. Rook AC8. And I think the answer is voila. We have reached the position that Grandmaster Wolf put in the book. So black voluntarily got this backward pawn with his move E5 on the sixth move, but that's a very typical move in these kind of not off Sicilians. And yes, black understands he's going to have a backward pawn, but he's got some compensation for it, as both Grandmaster Wolf and the computer showed you. Okay, so today we've tried to talk about what is and what is not a backward pawn. Hopefully from my examples, you've got a pretty good idea what is. You understand why I slightly disagreed with the other authors' definitions. Does that make their definitions wrong? Of course not. There is no official dictionary of chess. But next time you run into backward pawn, please don't confuse backward pawn with a back pawn. Back and backward are similar words, mean different things. Backward pawn is very specific. If you just have an isolated pawn, a doubled pawn, or a backward pawn, generally the backward pawn is the weakest of the three, but a backward pawn is still worth a lot more than 0. If a pawn's worth 1 and a backward pawn's the weakest of the three, it may only be worth 0.8 or something, but you're still worth an awful lot. You don't lose a lot when your pawns are weak, but you don't want to get them weak for nothing, because that's how you can lose games. If you had enough fractions adding up, it doesn't take much to lose a game. Okay, for my YouTube series, this is Dan Heisman. Hope you enjoyed it. It was a tough one, but that's the way it goes. It was a lot of fun too. See you next time. Bye.